"I was going to let you go this time," he said, his voice low and fractured, like the sound of ice breaking over a winter river. His dark eyes held hers across the dusty length of the sheriff's office, and the lantern light threw shadows across his jaw that made him look older than his 29 years, worn down to the bone by something she could not yet name. Theresa Townsend stood with her wrists still raw from the rope they had used to bind her dress torn at the sleeve, her dark hair falling loose from the pins she had set so carefully that morning in what felt like another lifetime. She had expected many things when Oscar Crawford had finally walked through that door. She had expected fury. She had expected that cold, professional distance he wore like armor. She had expected him to hand her over to the federal marshal waiting outside without so much as a backward glance. She had not expected those words. She had not expected the way his throat moved when he swallowed, the way his hands balled into fists at his sides as if he were fighting something inside himself that refused to stay quiet. "I was going to let you go this time," he said again, and the repetition of it sent a tremor through her chest that she could not explain. She looked at him for a long moment. The marshal outside was growing impatient. She could hear the man's boots on the wooden porch, that restless back-and-forth pacing, the occasional clink of his spurs. She had perhaps 2 minutes before this moment collapsed into something irreversible. She kept her voice steady even though nothing inside her was steady at all. "What changed?" Oscar Crawford looked at her like she had just pressed her hand flat against an open wound, and she watched something break open behind his eyes that he had been keeping sealed for a very long time. He did not answer immediately. He crossed the room instead, slow and deliberate, and she did not back away even though every rational thought she possessed told her she should. He stopped close enough that she could smell the trail dust on his coat, close enough that she could see the faint scar above his left eyebrow, a detail she had catalogued without meaning to somewhere along the weeks that had brought them to this terrible, impossible moment. "Everything," he said. "Everything changed." And that was the beginning of the end of everything she thought she understood about herself, about him, and about the kind of love that only grows in the hardest, most unforgiving soil. 6 weeks earlier, the town of Carro Blanco, New Mexico Territory, had been the last place on earth Theresa Townsend intended to stop. It was the summer of 1882, and the territory was a place caught between worlds, balanced on the knife edge between lawlessness and something that was trying very hard to become civilization. The railroad had come through 3 years prior, stitching the desert together with iron and ambition, and towns like Carro Blanco had sprung up in its wake like wildflowers after rain, hopeful and fragile, and full of people who had run out of other options. Theresa was 26 years old, a school teacher by training and a fugitive by recent circumstance, though the word fugitive carried implications she would have contested with considerable heat. She had been born in Ohio, raised in St. Louis, and had spent the better part of 3 years following a man named Emmett Voss across the Western Territories, because she had believed, with the whole of her young heart, that he was an honest man building something real. She had been wrong about that, profoundly and humiliatingly wrong, and when the scope of Emmett Voss's dishonesty had finally revealed itself in a federal land fraud case that swallowed 6 investors and left 3 families destitute, Theresa had been left standing in the wreckage holding documents she had unwittingly signed, and a reputation she no longer recognized as her own. She had not committed any crime. She had been used, manipulated, her schoolteacher's signature placed on paper she had trusted him to explain truthfully. But the truth was a complicated thing to prove when the man who could best prove it had disappeared into Mexico, and the federal authorities were casting a wide net looking for anyone connected to the Voss land scheme. Theresa had made the decision, in the cold gray morning after the warrant had been issued, that she would not wait around in St. Louis to be arrested for sins she had not committed. She would find Emmett Voss. She would get the documents that proved her innocence, and then she would come back and clear her name properly. That plan had taken her through Kansas and into the territory, through 3 near misses with federal agents and one genuinely terrifying confrontation with a deputy who had not believed her explanations, and finally into the town of Carro Blanco on a Wednesday afternoon in July, when the heat was so fierce that the air itself seemed to shimmer and pulse like something alive and angry. She arrived on the afternoon stage from Las Cruces, dusty and tired, and wearing a dress that had seen better weeks, and the first person she saw when she stepped down from the coach was Oscar Crawford. She did not know who he was then. She only knew that he was watching the stage with the particular quality of attention that she had learned to recognize in the weeks since her trouble had started. That focused, measuring stillness. The kind of look that categorized and assessed and filed information away without apparent effort. He was leaning against the post outside the livery stable with his arms crossed and his hat pulled low against the afternoon sun. He wore a marshal's badge pinned to his vest, she noticed, and her stomach dropped about 3 inches. She kept walking, kept her face composed, kept her stride even and purposeful as she crossed the main street toward the hotel. She did not look back. She registered him in the way that a person registers a thundercloud forming on the horizon, with specific, calculated attention, and then she put him in the category of threats to be managed and turned her mind to the more immediate problem of finding a room and figuring out what she was going to do next. She had a name, a contact name, given to her in Las Cruces by a woman who had known Emmett Voss in his earlier, more legitimate days. A man named Darvell who ran a freight operation out of Carro Blanco, and who, according to her source, had been sending supplies south of the border for the past 6 months, to a destination he described vaguely as a mining concern, but that everyone in the know understood to mean Emmett Voss's hiding place. She had $40 left, a carpet bag containing 2 dresses and a collection of documents she guarded more carefully than she guarded her own life, and approximately the forward momentum of someone who has committed to a course of action and cannot afford to examine it too closely. What she did not have was any idea that Oscar Crawford already knew exactly who she was. He had received the federal circular on Theresa Townsend 3 weeks prior. It had come through the regular mail, along with a personal note from the district federal marshal, a man named Aldrich Peel, who was coordinating the Voss investigation, and had put Theresa at the top of his list of persons of interest. The circular described her as educated, resourceful, and potentially traveling toward the New Mexico territory based on intelligence gathered from her former associates in St. Louis. There was a daguerreotype attached, a formal portrait taken some years prior in which she looked serious and composed in a dark dress with her hair pinned up, and Oscar had looked at it with the professional interest of a man cataloging a target and thought only that it was a surprisingly poor likeness, because the woman in the photograph looked contained and finished, and something about the word resourceful suggested a person considerably more alive than that. He had been the marshal for Carro Blanco and the surrounding 3 counties for 4 years. He was good at his job in the way that men who have very little else are good at the things they commit themselves to completely. He had grown up in Colorado, the son of a cattle rancher who had lost everything to a drought and a bad business partner in roughly equal measure, and he had learned early that the world was a place full of hidden motives and forced choices and people who were not what they presented themselves to be. He had become a lawman because the law, for all its imperfections, was at least a framework, a set of rules that did not shift depending on who was watching. He had never had particular trouble separating his professional obligations from his personal inclinations. He had never had reason to. When Theresa Townsend stepped off the afternoon stage and walked across the main street of Carro Blanco with that careful, measured stride and that look of absolute composure that he suspected was costing her a great deal of effort, Oscar Crawford uncrossed his arms and straightened up and told himself that this was going to be a straightforward matter. He was wrong about that, profoundly and humiliatingly wrong. though it would take him considerably longer to admit it than it had taken Theresa to admit her corresponding error about Emmett Voss. He gave her 3 days. He had learned, over 4 years of chasing people across the territory, that 3 days was usually sufficient for a person to settle into a pattern, and a pattern was a weakness, and a weakness was a door. He watched from a professional distance. He noted where she took her meals, which was at the hotel dining room every morning at 7, and at a small establishment across from the dry goods store in the evenings. He noted that she visited the freight office on her 2nd day in town, that she came out again after 20 minutes with nothing in her hands, and a look on her face that he had learned to associate with useful information received. He noted that she spent her afternoons in the public reading room adjacent to the courthouse, going through the territorial land records with the focused intensity of someone following a specific thread through a complicated pattern. She was looking for Voss. He understood that. What he did not yet understand was what she intended to do when she found him. On the 3rd day, he stopped giving her room and decided to introduce himself. He caught her coming out of the reading room at 3:30, when the afternoon heat was beginning its grudging retreat and the shadows were starting to stretch long and golden across the packed earth of the main street. "Miss Townsend," he said. She stopped. He watched the micro-adjustment happen across her face. That flicker of calculation quickly smoothed away, and he was struck again by how good she was at composure. Most people, when their name was called by a marshal they hadn't introduced themselves to, showed fear first. She showed something more complicated than fear. Assessment. Recalibration. "Marshal," she said, and her voice was steady and educated and nothing like what he had expected from the circular's description of her circumstances. "Oscar Crawford," he said. "I'm the marshal for Carro Blanco. I was hoping you might have a few minutes." "I might," she said, which was not yes and not no, which was exactly what a careful person would say. "The hotel has a sitting room," he offered. "Public place, other people around. Nothing to be concerned about." "I'm not concerned," she said, which was a lie so composed that he almost believed it. They sat in the hotel sitting room with the afternoon light coming through the lace curtains and a pair of elderly women playing cards at the far table providing the comfortable cover of witnesses, and Oscar laid his hand on the table in a way that was not quite cards but was honest. "I know who you are," he said. "I have a federal circular with your name on it. I know you're connected to the Voss land case and I know there's a federal warrant outstanding." She said nothing. She held his gaze with an evenness that he found, despite himself, genuinely impressive. "I also know," he continued because he believed in being complete, "that the circular lists you as a person of interest rather than a defendant. That's a meaningful distinction." "It is," she agreed. "You want to tell me your version?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment, and he got the impression of someone doing a rapid and sophisticated calculation of risk. Then she said, "I signed documents I didn't fully understand, prepared by a man I trusted, on behalf of a land scheme I didn't know existed. I have evidence that demonstrates this, including correspondence that shows Voss deliberately withheld information from me before requesting my signature. That evidence is in my possession. The problem is that a federal arrest record attached to my name, before I have the opportunity to present that evidence in the proper context, would make a great deal of difference to how that evidence is received." It was the most articulate and direct account he had ever heard someone give of their own legal predicament, and it landed with a weight that was difficult to dismiss. "Where is Voss?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I'm going to find out. And when you do," she looked at him steadily, "I intend to retrieve the remaining documents that prove my innocence, documents that Voss took with him when he left. I am not asking you to help me, Marshal Crawford. I am only telling you the truth because you asked for it." Oscar looked at her for what was probably an inappropriate number of seconds given the professional nature of the conversation. Then he said, "I have an obligation to report your presence here to the federal marshal's office in Santa Fe." "I know," she said. That report will go out with the next mail rider on Saturday. I know, she said again. Saturday was 4 days away. He was not certain afterward when he examined the conversation with the uncomfortable precision he applied to things that troubled him, that the 4-day detail had been anything other than an accident. He had not intended it as a gift. He was not in the habit of offering gifts to fugitives, even fugitives whose cases were morally complicated. But he had said it, and the silence after he said it had been full of something neither of them named. She thanked him. She stood, smoothed her skirt with the particular economy of movement that he was beginning to recognize as distinctly hers, and walked out of the sitting room. And Oscar Crawford sat for a moment in the lace-curtained afternoon light and tried to identify the sensation in his chest with some precision. He was not successful. Over the next 4 days, something began that Oscar Crawford had no name for, and Theresa Townsend would not have permitted herself to name even if she had. It was not a courtship, it was not a friendship. It was something more like two intelligent people who had been, each in their own way, profoundly alone for a long time, suddenly in the proximity of someone who seemed to understand the texture of that aloneness from the inside. He found reasons to be in the same spaces she occupied. She did not discourage this, which he noted. He sat down across from her in the reading room on the second day without asking, and she moved her papers to make room without looking up, and they spent 2 hours in that space with nothing but the scratch of a pencil and the occasional turning of pages between them. And it was the most comfortable he had been in a room with another person in longer than he could easily remember. She asked him about the territorial records on the third day, about how the land grant system worked, and he explained it with the care of someone who had spent 4 years watching people lose everything to the gaps and contradictions in that system. And she listened with the full, focused attention of someone for whom this was not abstract. And somewhere in the middle of explaining the process by which forged signatures could be used to transfer claim rights, he looked up and found her watching him with an expression that he did not know what to do with. "You care about it," she said. "The justice of it, not just the law of it." He considered this. "Is there a difference?" "Always," she said, with a certainty that suggested considerable personal experience with the gap between those two things. On the 4th evening, the night before the mail rider was due to leave for Santa Fe, they walked. It was not planned. He found her on the porch of the hotel as the sun was going down, the sky turning that particular color of deep rose and gold that the desert sky did in the evenings, a color so extravagant it looked painted. She was standing with her arms wrapped around herself despite the lingering warmth of the evening, and she had the look of someone who was trying to hold themselves together by main force of will. He stopped beside her. He did not speak immediately. They stood together in the cooling air and watched the sky change colors. "I'm afraid," she said finally without looking at him. It was the most unguarded thing she had said to him, and he understood the cost of it. "I know," he said. "Not of you," she clarified. "I want to be clear about that." "I know," he said again. She turned to look at him then, and in the last warm light of the evening she looked like something painted too, something vivid and complicated and entirely real. And Oscar Crawford felt the particular terrifying sensation of a carefully constructed certainty beginning to crack. What happens if you find Voss and you don't get what you need? He asked because he was a man who believed in asking the hard questions directly. "Then I go back anyway," she said, "because at some point you have to stop running, even if the stopping costs you everything." He thought about that for a long time. The mail rider left on Saturday morning with a report that described a possible sighting of a woman, matching the Townsend description traveling through Las Cruces, which was technically not a lie, because technically she had traveled through Las Cruces, and technically Oscar Crawford had written the report before she arrived in Carro Blanco. He told himself these technical truths with the focused deliberateness of a man who understood exactly what he was doing, and was doing it anyway, which was perhaps the most honest form of self-deception available to him. He had 4 days before the federal marshal's office would respond to the Las Cruces information and redirect their attention. Possibly more, given the distances involved and the unreliability of mail service in the territory. In those 4 days, he decided, he would help Theresa Townsend find what she needed to clear her name. He told her this the following morning over coffee in the hotel dining room, and the expression that moved across her face when he said it was something that he filed away in a part of himself that he did not usually allow to accumulate. Why? She asked. Because she was a person who asked direct questions. He considered a number of answers and discarded most of them. Finally, he said, because the law is supposed to be a framework for justice, and when it isn't, someone has to decide which one they're serving. She looked at him for a long moment. That could get you disbarred as a marshal. Yes, he agreed. It could get you arrested. That too. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Oscar, she said, which was the first time she had used his name without the formal prefix, and the simplicity of it landed somewhere in his chest with a weight that was disproportionate to the 2 syllables. You barely know me. I know enough, he said, which was true in the ways that mattered and incomplete in the ways that would take considerably longer. The lead on Voss's location came through Darvell's freight operation, exactly as Theresa had suspected it would. It took 3 more days of careful conversation, and one particularly tense interview in which Oscar's badge did most of the persuading, and at the end of it they had a location. A small settlement called Agua Prieta, just across the border in Sonora, where a man answering Voss's description had been living for 5 months under a different name, and running a modest cattle-buying operation that everyone in the area understood to be something other than what it appeared. They could not go to Mexico. Oscar made this point clearly. He had jurisdiction in the territory and exactly none of it south of the border, and whatever they found when they got to Voss, they needed it to hold up in a federal court, which meant it needed to be obtained in a manner that was at least approximately legal. I'll go alone, Theresa said, with the particular calm of someone who has already thought through the worst-case scenarios and decided to proceed anyway. No, Oscar said. You have no authority there. No, he said again, and the repetition was different from the first time, less a legal objection and more a thing from a deeper place, and she heard the difference because she was the kind of person who heard those things. They crossed into Sonora on a Thursday morning with a cover story that Oscar constructed with professional care. They were a married couple, Theresa and Oscar Crawford, traveling south to visit family. He had a friend in the territorial rangers who had provided them with a letter of introduction to a contact in Agua Prieta, a local official who was at least theoretically cooperative with American law enforcement on matters of mutual interest. It was a thin framework and they both knew it, but it was what they had. The ride south took most of the day. They crossed the border at a quiet point and followed a track through scrubland and low hills that the late July heat had turned to shades of brown and gold, and the sky above them was a blue so deep it almost hurt to look at. They rode side by side without much conversation in the beginning, both of them occupied with the particular focused alertness of people moving toward something potentially dangerous. Then, somewhere in the long afternoon, the alertness settled into something else. They began to talk. Not about Voss, not about the warrant or the documents or the careful legal architecture they were trying to construct. They talked about other things. About Ohio, where Theresa had grown up in a house with a garden full of fruit trees, and a father who had believed that education was the most important thing a person could give a child, regardless of the child's sex, which had made him unusual for his time, and had given Theresa certain stubborn convictions about her own capacity that had served her well in most circumstances and gotten her into trouble in others. About Colorado, where Oscar had learned to ride before he learned to read, and had spent his childhood in the kind of outdoor freedom that leaves marks on a person that don't wash off. About teaching, which Theresa had done for 2 years in a school in Kansas City before Voss had come into her life with his confident manner and his plausible plans. about what it felt like to watch the thing you had trusted most reveal itself as false. What was the moment, he asked, meaning the moment she had known. She was quiet for a stretch. The horses moved steadily beneath them, and the landscape spread out in all directions in its vast, indifferent beauty. He had a letter, she said finally. I found it in his desk when I was looking for something else. A letter from a man named Barrett, who was one of the investors, asking for a full accounting of where his $20,000 had gone. And Emmett had written a response, a draft left in the drawer, that was all reassurance and deflection and not a single number in it. And I realized that I had never seen a single actual number either. In all the months I had been part of his life, I had seen presentations and proposals and plans, but never a single set of real accounts. And you knew then, Oscar said. I knew then, she confirmed. I also knew that my name was on 3 separate documents that I had signed as a witness or co-applicant, and that my having known him for as long as I had would make innocence difficult to argue. What did you do? I took copies of everything I could find that showed his deception, left the originals in place so he wouldn't know immediately what I'd done, and went back to my rooms to decide what to do next. By the next morning, the federal warrants had been issued and Emmett was already gone, and I had approximately 4 hours to decide whether to stay and try to explain or go. Oscar thought about this. You went. I went, she agreed. Which was probably the wrong decision in terms of appearances. But the right decision in terms of survival, he said. She looked at him. Yes. Those aren't always the same thing, he said, and something in the way he said it suggested that he was speaking from something more than abstract principle. She asked him then about the wrong decisions of his own that had shaped him. He was quiet for so long that she thought perhaps she had overstepped, and then he told her about the year before he became a marshal, when he had been a deputy in a mining town in Colorado called Rays Creek, and about a man named Fowler who had been operating a protection scheme that everyone in the town knew about and no one would speak openly against, because Fowler was connected to men who had the power to make things very difficult for anyone who opposed them. Oscar had built a careful case against Fowler over 8 months. He had witnesses who were prepared to testify. He had documentation. He had everything he needed. Then, 2 days before the circuit judge was due to arrive, Fowler had his men burn down the home of Oscar's primary witness, a man named Gallegos who had a wife and 3 children. They had gotten out safely, but the message was clear. When Oscar had gone to Gallegos the next morning to confirm he would still testify, he had found a man who was ash-pale with terror looking at him across a table while his children slept in the next room. I told him not to testify, Oscar said. I withdrew the case. I let Fowler go. Because a man's family was more important than the case, Theresa said. Because a man's family was more important, he confirmed. But Fowler took that as a signal that he could do whatever he wanted, and the following year he had a man killed who tried to start a competing operation. So my choice had consequences that I had not fully accounted for. They rode in silence for a moment. What happened to Fowler eventually? She asked. He's in the federal penitentiary in Denver, Oscar said. A U.S. Marshal named Herring built a case against him that included the killing 2 years later. Then the outcome was correct in the end, even though your path wasn't. Yes, he said, but Gallegos still lost his house, and the man Fowler had killed was still dead. She understood then something about what drove Oscar Crawford that went deeper than professional obligation. He was not a man who was simply following rules. He was a man who was trying, with imperfect tools in an imperfect world, to make the outcome correct. And the gap between the attempt and the outcome was something he carried with him in a way that had shaped him down to the bone. They reached Agua Prieta in the early evening, when the sky was darkening to purple, and the first stars were beginning to appear above the low hills to the east. It was a small settlement, dusty and quiet, with a central plaza and a church, and a scattering of buildings that ranged from adobe merchants' houses to rougher structures at the edges. Oscar's ranger contact had arranged their lodging with a local family, and their room, which they had agreed to share as a necessity of their cover story rather than a personal choice, was clean and simply furnished with a view of the plaza. It was the proximity, Oscar thought later, that changed things. Not in a dramatic way, not in the way of forbidden things breaking free, but in the simpler and more terrifying way of two people sharing a small space and discovering that the other person's presence in it is not uncomfortable, but is instead, inconveniently, the most comfortable thing they have felt in years. They found Emmett Voss on the second day. He was sitting in a cantina on the south side of the plaza, a man in his mid-30s with the look of someone who had been handsome once and had become something softer and less defined, eating his midday meal with the settled ease of a person who had convinced themselves that the worst consequences of their choices had been successfully avoided. Theresa saw him first. She had come around the corner of the building just ahead of Oscar, and she stopped so suddenly that he nearly walked into her, and then she turned to look at him, and her face held a complex map of emotions that she was, for once, not entirely successful in composing into stillness. "That's him," she said quietly. Oscar looked. He had seen the federal photographs of Voss, and the man at the table matched them closely enough to confirm the identification. He was on his second glass of something, relaxed, speaking with a companion, utterly unaware that he was being watched. "What do you want to do?" Oscar asked her, because it was her situation. It was her life that had been disrupted and her name that needed clearing, and whatever happened in the next few minutes would shape what came after in ways that she deserved to control. She straightened her back. The composure came back, full and complete, like a door closing. "I'm going to speak to him," she said. "And you are going to be near enough to hear everything." "Theresa," he said. She looked at him. "If he becomes dangerous," he started. "He won't," she said. "Emmett Voss is not brave. That was always the problem with him. He had the imagination to deceive but not the courage to defend it." She was right, as it turned out. She walked into the cantina and crossed to his table and sat down across from him, and Oscar positioned himself at the bar with a line of sight to the table and his hand resting casually near his holster, and watched the scene unfold. Voss's face, when he saw her, was a study in pure, unguarded terror. It lasted approximately 3 seconds before he managed to replace it with something more controlled. He had not expected her. He had expected the federal marshals eventually, perhaps. He had not expected Theresa Townsend, walking toward him alone across a cantina in Mexico with that expression of absolute clarity in her eyes. She spoke to him for 20 minutes. Oscar could not hear the words from his position at the bar, but he watched the body language with the attention he had developed over years of reading situations at a distance, and what he saw was interesting. Voss tried, initially, the posture of the wronged party. This dissolved rapidly. Then he tried the posture of the man with leverage, which also dissolved, because whatever Theresa said to him in her clear, measured way dismantled it efficiently. Then, around the 15-minute mark, something shifted. Voss reached into his coat. Oscar's hand tightened on his pistol, but what came out was not a weapon. It was a folded set of papers. Theresa took them. She looked at them. She looked up at Voss. She said something, 3 or 4 words, and stood, and walked back across the cantina toward Oscar with the papers held against her chest and an expression that was not triumph but was something more complicated and more honest than triumph. The expression of someone who has closed a door on a chapter of their life that they are very glad to see ended. "I have what I need," she said when she reached him. "What did you say to him at the end?" Oscar asked. She was quiet for a moment. "I told him that I hoped he would eventually understand what he had cost the people he deceived, not out of cruelty, just because I thought he should know that it was real, the damage, not abstract." Oscar looked at her, and he said he was sorry, she said, which was probably the first completely honest thing he ever said to me. They rode back to the border the following morning, and the conversation on the ride back was different from the ride south. The tension that had animated their journey toward Agua Prieta had resolved into something else, something looser and warmer, and the spaces between their words were comfortable in a way that Oscar found himself wanting to preserve. Somewhere in the long afternoon miles, Theresa said, "When we get back, what happens?" He had been thinking about this with the part of his mind that ran calculations continuously in the background, the practical, professional part that had not entirely gone quiet even in the midst of everything else. "You go to Santa Fe," he said, "to the federal marshal's office, with the documents. You tell your account in full. The documents you've retrieved, combined with the evidence you already had, should be sufficient to have your status changed from person of interest to witness." "Should be," she noted. "Should be," he agreed. "The law is imperfect." "And you?" she asked. "I go back to Carro Blanco," he said, "and I file an accurate report." She absorbed this. "That report will include the fact that you found me in Carro Blanco and did not immediately detain me." "Yes," he said. "That will have consequences for you." "Probably," he said. "Oscar," she said, and the way she said it this time was different from all the previous times, something in it that she was not quite containing. "Theresa," he said in the same register. They both looked straight ahead at the track unwinding through the scrubland for a moment, and then she said quietly, "I don't know how to do this. I don't know what this is, and I am aware that the timing and the circumstances are fairly spectacularly unsuitable." He thought about the correct thing to say for a moment. Then he said, "I know what it is. It is two people who found each other at the worst possible time and are going to have to figure out what to do about that once the worst possible time is over." She turned to look at him. The afternoon light caught the side of her face, and she was, in that moment, the most real person he had ever seen. "Is that a plan?" she asked, and there was the faintest edge of something that was almost humor in it, which was new and remarkable. "It is the beginning of a plan," he said seriously, "which is more than either of us had a week ago." They arrived back in Carro Blanco on a Friday evening to find a telegram waiting for Oscar at the marshal's office from Federal Marshal Aldrich Peel in Santa Fe, informing him that information had come through suggesting the Townsend woman might be in or around the Carro Blanco area, and asking for confirmation or denial and immediate action if applicable. Oscar stood in his office reading the telegram for a long moment. Deputy Holt, a good-natured young man of 22 who had been holding down the office in Oscar's absence, watched him with the curious expression of someone who has correctly identified that something unusual is happening, but does not yet know what. Oscar set the telegram down. He went to the door of the back room where Theresa was waiting, the small room he used for witnesses and occasionally for persons in protective custody. She was sitting on the plain wooden chair with her hands folded in her lap and those papers held carefully in her coat pocket, and she looked up when he appeared in the doorway. He handed her the telegram without comment. She read it. She looked up at him. Her face was composed, but the composure was effortful now in a way that it had not been before, in a way that suggested that her reserves of careful control were beginning to run lower than she wanted to acknowledge. "What are you going to do?" she asked. And this was the moment he had been building toward without knowing it, the moment that would cost him something real and that he was choosing anyway, with clear eyes and a settled heart. "I'm going to send a reply saying that you are in my custody and that you are being transported to Santa Fe with evidence relevant to the Voss case," he said. "Which will be true. I will take you to Santa Fe myself. You will present your evidence. And I will be there to testify on your behalf regarding the nature and quality of the evidence you've brought." She stared at him. "You would testify in my favor, to a federal marshal?" "Yes." "After having concealed your knowledge of my presence here for 2 weeks?" "Yes." "Oscar, that could end your career." "I know. It could result in charges against you." "I know that too." She stood. She was close to him in the small space of the doorway, and she looked at him with that direct, unguarded intensity that was the most honest thing about her and said, "Why would you do that?" He looked at her for a long moment. The answer was simple and enormous, And he was not a man who said simple, enormous things lightly or easily, but he said it anyway. Because you are innocent and you deserve justice. And because somewhere in the last 2 weeks you stopped being a case I was managing and became something else entirely, and I would like very much to find out what that something else is, if you're willing. But the first part is true regardless of the second part. The silence that followed this was the kind that changes the shape of a room. She reached out and put her hand on his arm, and it was not a dramatic gesture, not a thing from a novel, just a real woman's real hand resting against his forearm, and it hit him harder than anything dramatic could have. "All right," she said quietly. "Santa Fe." The journey to Santa Fe took 3 days by stage. Oscar sent his deputy Holt ahead with a telegram to Aldrich Peel confirming their arrival date, and he arranged for Theresa's documents to be reviewed by a territorial lawyer in Carro Blanco before they left. A man named Prentice who had a good reputation, and who spent 2 hours going through everything with thorough professional care, and came out of that review with an expression that Oscar interpreted as guardedly optimistic. "The correspondence she has from Voss is significant," Prentice told Oscar privately. "Particularly the letter in which he specifically instructs her not to inquire into the financial details of the transactions she is signing. If a court interprets that as evidence of deliberate concealment from a cosigner, it goes a long way toward establishing her as a victim rather than a participant." They traveled with 2 other passengers in the stage, which provided the kind of enforced proximity that required either hostility or easy familiarity, and they defaulted easily and naturally to the latter. Theresa talked with the other passengers, a merchant's wife named Clara Hoffman and her teenage daughter, with a warmth and ease that Oscar watched with quiet attention, noting the way she had of making people feel that what they were saying was genuinely interesting to her, because it genuinely was. She was, he thought, someone who had been built for the kind of life that involved other people, and the months of isolation that her circumstances had required had cost her something that she was visibly glad to begin releasing. He caught her eye once across the stage and she smiled at him, and it was such an uncomplicated thing, that smile, after all the complexity and weight of the past weeks, that he had to look away for a moment because the feeling it generated in his chest was something he did not want to manage in a confined space. Santa Fe was, in 1882, a city of some ambition and considerable history, its Spanish colonial architecture giving it a character distinct from the newer settlements of the territory. The federal marshal's office was housed in a solid adobe building near the plaza, and Aldrich Peel proved to be a serious man in his late 40s with a precise manner, and the kind of legal mind that cataloged information rapidly and did not miss details. He interviewed Theresa for 4 hours. Oscar waited in the outer office, which was among the longest 4 hours he had spent in recent memory. He sat with his hat in his hands and thought about what was being said in the room beyond the door, and about the contingencies, and about what he was going to do if the outcome was not the one he was working toward. When Peel finally came out, he looked at Oscar with an expression that was difficult to read. "Your involvement in this matter is irregular," Peel said. "I know," Oscar said. "Your report to this office from 6 weeks ago placed her in Las Cruces when you had reason to believe she was in your jurisdiction." "Yes," Oscar said. "You want to explain that?" Oscar met Peel's eyes directly. "I believed, based on my assessment of the case, that allowing Miss Townsend the opportunity to retrieve the evidence she needed would produce a better outcome for the investigation than an immediate arrest, which would have placed her in federal custody with an incomplete evidentiary picture and a much weaker case for the prosecution overall." Peel looked at him for a long moment. "That's a creative interpretation of your discretionary authority." "It is," Oscar agreed. "The evidence she has brought is substantial," Peel said, and something in his tone shifted slightly. "The Voss correspondence, particularly, is something our investigation had not previously had access to." Combined with the financial records and the witness account she has from Las Cruces, it materially changes the picture of her involvement. He paused. I'm not prepared to say this is fully resolved today. There will be a formal review, but my current assessment is that her continued cooperation as a witness is considerably more valuable than her prosecution as a defendant. Oscar breathed. That said, Peel continued, I'm going to need a full accounting of your actions over the past 6 weeks, Crawford, in writing, and it will be reviewed by the district supervisor. Understood, Oscar said. Theresa came out of the interview room 20 minutes later, and the expression on her face when she saw him standing in the outer office was one that he would remember with perfect clarity for the rest of his life. Relief and exhaustion, and something so open and unguarded that it was almost like watching someone take off armor they had forgotten they were wearing. He stepped toward her, and she crossed the last few feet between them, and he put his arms around her with the uncomplicated instinct of someone doing the only sensible thing, and she stood against his chest for a moment with her hands gripping the lapels of his coat, and he could feel her breathing even out slowly, and he thought that this was one of the best moments of his life so far, and that the bar for the subsequent moments was now set quite high. Well, he said into her hair. They're calling me a witness, she said, not a defendant. Good, he said, it's not finished, there will be a formal process. There will, he agreed, but a witness can go home. She pulled back to look at him. I don't currently have a home, she said, which was practically true and also something considerably more than practical. I know, he said. I have a thought about that. She raised her eyebrows. Carro Blanco, he said, does not have a school teacher. It has had a series of inadequate substitutes for the past year, and the town has been making inquiries through the Territorial Education Board. The position would be formal, with a contract and appropriate compensation. She stared at him. You want me to come back to Carro Blanco? I want you to come back to Carro Blanco, he confirmed. As a school teacher, which is a legitimate and fully respectable position, and separately and entirely apart from that professional consideration, I would very much like to continue this conversation that we have been having for the past several weeks and see where it leads. The expression that moved across her face was complicated and wonderful. Oscar Crawford, she said, that is the most careful and roundabout declaration I have ever received. I am a careful man, he said. You are a man who sent a false report to the federal marshal's office and rode into Mexico on someone else's behalf, she countered. I'm a careful man who makes exceptions, he amended. She looked at him for a long moment with those dark eyes that he had been reading and misreading and learning to read better for weeks. Then she said, yes, to Carro Blanco, to the teaching position, and to the other thing. The other thing, he repeated. The conversation, she said, with precision that was entirely genuine and entirely affectionate at once. He smiled. It was a somewhat unfamiliar feeling, smiling without reservation, but it turned out to be a natural one. They remained in Santa Fe for 4 more days, while the formal paperwork was arranged, and the letters of introduction for the teaching position were obtained, and Oscar gave his full written account to Aldrich Peel's office with the careful honesty that had cost him the false comfort of a cleaner story. Peel's review of that account resulted in a formal censure that would live in Oscar's file, a notation of irregular conduct in the management of the Townsend matter. It did not cost him his badge, which he had expected might happen and had decided in advance to accept if it did. The reasons for the censure were noted in the same document, and Peel, who was a thorough man, had noted that the result of Crawford's irregular conduct had produced significant evidence for the federal prosecution of Emmett Voss that would not otherwise have been obtained. It was not a full vindication, but it was an honest account. In the evenings in Santa Fe, while the formal processes ground forward with their usual deliberate pace, Oscar and Theresa walked the streets of the old city in the long summer dusk and talked. They talked about everything. About what they wanted, in the way that people who have been afraid to want things for a while talk about wanting once the fear begins to loosen. About what the world looked like when you stripped away the obligations and the circumstances and the contingencies and looked at what was actually there. About what he believed in, about what she believed in, about the places where those beliefs were the same and the places where they were different, and why those differences were interesting rather than alarming. On the third evening in Santa Fe, he kissed her in the narrow street beside the church, in the soft darkness between the lamplight, with the smell of piñon smoke in the air and the sound of someone playing a guitar somewhere nearby. She kissed him back with the same thorough attention she gave to everything, and afterward she rested her forehead against his for a moment, and they stood in the quiet darkness feeling the particular peace that comes after a very long time of difficulty, the peace that is not empty but full. They returned to Carro Blanco at the end of August with the territory beginning its slow, gorgeous transition toward fall, the cottonwoods along the creek beds starting to turn gold at their edges. Theresa settled into her position at the school with the efficiency and genuine enthusiasm of someone returning to work they love after a period of forced absence. The school was a single-room building on the east side of town, weathered but solid, with 18 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, and she set about the work of transforming it from a room where children were sometimes taught into a real school, with the particular focused energy that Oscar was coming to understand as characteristically hers. He watched her, sometimes, through the school window when he was making his rounds in the morning. Not with the calculating attention of a lawman tracking a case, but with the simpler and more honest attention of a man watching someone he loves do the thing they are best at. She was extraordinary with the children, firm and warm and funny in equal measure, and the transformation in the school's atmosphere over the first month was remarked upon by more than one parent who stopped Oscar in the street to comment on it with obvious pleasure. The town received her with a mixture of the warmth and the sideways caution that small frontier communities offered to newcomers. People were curious. Some of them had heard rumors, vague stories about her connection to a federal case, the kind of incomplete information that circulates in small places like water finding its level. Oscar had thought about how to handle this and ultimately decided that the simplest and most effective approach was the truth. He told it, simply and directly, to the people who asked, and he told it in a way that made clear his own role in the matter and his own assessment of it, and the effect was approximately what he had hoped. In a town full of people who had their own complicated histories and their own reasons for being in the territory rather than somewhere else, Theresa Townsend's story was more comprehensible than alarming. She had been deceived by a man she trusted. She had found a way to correct the record, and she had come to do honest work in an honest place. This was a story people in Carro Blanco recognized. What was harder, and what Oscar had not fully anticipated, was the formal review process that continued in Santa Fe through September and October. Peel's office sent correspondence regularly. The Voss prosecution was proceeding, and Theresa's testimony was being formalized, which required 2 more trips to Santa Fe, one in September and one in October, both of which Oscar accompanied her on because the territory was not a place where a woman traveling alone on a stage was without risk, and because the idea of her managing those trips without him was something that did not sit comfortably with him, regardless of his complete confidence in her capability. The October trip was the one that brought the near catastrophe. They arrived in Santa Fe on a Wednesday morning to find the federal marshal's office in a state of barely controlled tension. Peel met them himself at the door of the building, which was unusual, and his expression told Oscar immediately that something had changed. Emmett Voss had retained a lawyer, a good one from Denver, a man named Bellows with a reputation for taking complicated federal cases and finding the technical gaps. Bellows had filed a motion 2 days earlier, arguing that the evidence obtained by Theresa in Agua Prieta had been obtained in violation of the conditions of her status as a federal person of interest, and that her unauthorized travel to a foreign country in the company of a federal officer who had himself reported her location inaccurately constituted a chain of irregular conduct that should taint the evidence. It was a legal argument, and it was not a stupid one, and Oscar could see from Peel's face that he was taking it seriously. Theresa sat across from Peel in the interview room and listened to this with her hands flat on the table and her face very still, and then she said, "The documents Voss gave me in Agua Prieta were given voluntarily. He was not coerced. He was not threatened. I had no warrant. I made no formal demands. He gave them to me of his own free will, out of what I believe was a combination of guilt and the calculation that cooperation might serve his interests better than refusal." "That's your account," Peel said. "Bellows will argue your presence there, as a federal person of interest accompanied by a federal officer who had reported your location inaccurately, constitutes implicit coercion." "Then," Theresa said, with a precision that was controlled and deliberate, "you should get Voss on the stand and ask him whether he felt coerced, because he didn't. And Emmett Voss, for all his considerable faults, is a fundamentally cowardly man who will not maintain a lie under direct examination." There was a pause. Oscar said, "She's right about that." Peel looked at them both. Then he said, "I'm going to take that under advisement." They waited in Santa Fe for 4 days, while Peel and his legal team worked through the Bellows motion. It was the most difficult 4 days Oscar had spent since the situation with Fowler in Rays Creek, the particular torment of having done everything you could and waiting to find out whether it was enough. He and Theresa moved through those days together, occupying the same spaces, talking less than usual but with greater density in what was said, and he was aware every hour of those 4 days of the complete and serious nature of what he felt for her. The way it had sunk from the beginning's bright and uncertain surface down into something settled and permanent and entirely without ambiguity. On the 4th evening she said to him, "Whatever happens tomorrow, I need you to know that this," and she gestured between them a small, clear gesture, "is the real thing. Not the most convenient thing, not the best timed thing, the real thing." He put his hand over hers on the table. "I know," he said. "It's been the real thing since somewhere around the 2nd day, if I'm being honest." She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that was not a performance or a management, just completely hers, and he thought that he would spend a very long time finding new ways to be glad about it. Peel's office ruled against the Bellows motion on the 5th day. The judge assigned to the preliminary review found that Theresa's presence in Mexico was not governed by the conditions of her person of interest status, which carried no travel restrictions, and that evidence given voluntarily by a defendant to a private individual was not affected by the relationship between that individual and an accompanying federal officer. It was a narrow ruling, and Bellows would likely appeal, but it held the evidence in the case, and it held Theresa's status as witness rather than defendant. And when Peel told them the ruling in his office on that Friday morning, his face held the first expression Oscar had seen on it that was something approaching satisfaction. They were on the stage back to Carro Blanco by noon. In November, the Territorial Education Board made Theresa's position permanent, which came with a modest increase in her salary and a housing allowance that allowed her to take a proper room in a boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Fontaine, who had opinions about everything and baked bread on Thursdays that was genuinely remarkable. Theresa settled into the life of Carro Blanco with a completeness that Oscar watched with a complicated pleasure, the pleasure of watching someone find their footing in a place you love, and an underlying complication that had to do with the question of what came next. He was a methodical man, and also, as she had pointed out, one who made exceptions. He was aware that the normal timeline for the things he was contemplating was longer than the timeline they had actually followed, And he was also aware that the normal timeline had been constructed for a world where you had not spent 3 weeks learning someone's most difficult history and truest self under the kind of conditions that stripped away everything secondary. He did not believe that the circumstances had created what he felt. He believed the circumstances had simply accelerated what would have happened regardless, and the distinction mattered to him. He asked her to have dinner with him on a Friday in November. A real dinner, not the working meals they had been having for months, at the hotel dining room with the good linens and the candles that Mrs. Harding, the proprietress, lit in the evenings when she was feeling optimistic about the world. He put on his good coat and he left his badge in his office, which was a deliberate choice and one he thought she would understand, because he wanted this evening to be between the man and the woman rather than the marshal and the witness. She came down the stairs of the boarding house in a dress he had not seen before, dark green, with her hair done up in the careful way that meant she had spent time on it, and the expression on her face when she saw him standing on the porch below was the expression of a woman who has decided that something is worth the risk and is glad she decided it. They walked to the hotel in the cool November evening with the stars enormous overhead the way they only were in the desert, and they ate dinner across from each other with the candles between them, and talked about everything and nothing, about the school and the town and Colorado and Ohio and books, and all the ordinary things that become extraordinary when you are having them with the right person. After dinner they walked again, out to the edge of town where the desert began and the sky was all stars and silence, and Oscar said what he had been constructing and revising in his mind for the better part of 6 weeks. "I would like to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not yet, because I think it's right to give you more time, but I want you to know that I'm asking in that direction so there's no ambiguity." She turned to look at him in the starlight. He could not see her face clearly, but he could read her stillness, the particular quality of it. "You're asking in the direction of asking," she said. "Yes." "Oscar," she said. "Theresa," he said. "Ask me properly," she said. "I've had enough of the carefully constructed approach. Ask me properly." He took a breath. The stars were overhead and the desert was around them, and she was in front of him, the realest person he knew. "Theresa Townsend," he said, "will you marry me?" The pause was approximately 2 seconds long. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." He had a ring in his coat pocket, which was either presumptuous or optimistic depending on how you looked at it. A simple gold band with a small turquoise stone that he had found in a jeweler's shop in Santa Fe during the October visit, bought on an impulse that he had spent 2 months pretending, was not what it was. He put it on her finger in the starlight and she looked at it and then at him, and she laughed, a real, full, unconstrained laugh that was one of the most beautiful sounds he had heard in his life. "You had a ring," she said. "I had a ring," he confirmed. "How long?" "October," he admitted. "Oscar Crawford," she said, still laughing. "I told you I was asking in that direction," he said. They were married in the spring, on a May morning when the desert was briefly and extravagantly green, and the wildflowers were coming up in the scrubland, and the air smelled like something that was trying to be wonderful. The ceremony was held in the small church at the eastern end of Carro Blanco's Main Street, performed by a circuit minister named Donahue who came through the territory every 6 weeks, and who had married a number of Carro Blanco's residents over the years with a cheerful efficiency that suggested he genuinely enjoyed the work. The entire town seemed to come. This was not perhaps surprising, given that Oscar had been the marshal for 4 years and was known by essentially everyone, and Theresa had been teaching the town's children for 8 months and was rapidly approaching the same level of universal acquaintance from a different direction. Mrs. Fontaine brought her bread. Clara Hoffman, who had been on the stage to Santa Fe and had become, over the intervening months, something approaching a friend, attended with her husband and the teenage daughter who had graduated to genuine friendship with Theresa on the basis of a shared interest in literature. Deputy Holt stood with Oscar and looked appropriately solemn for the first 5 minutes, and then broke into a grin that he could not entirely contain. Theresa walked down the aisle of the small church on a May morning in 1883, in a dress the color of cream that Mrs. Fontaine had helped her make from fabric sourced with some difficulty from the Santa Fe dry goods merchant, and Oscar watched her come toward him with an expression that Mrs. Harding, who was sitting in the third row, later described to approximately everyone she knew as the most open she had ever seen a man's face be. The minister's words were simple. The vows were the traditional ones. When it came to the moment of the vows, Theresa looked at him while she said them with an attention that made the formal words feel entirely personal and entirely real, and Oscar said his in return with the same quality of complete presence, and Holt, in the front row, was definitely not wiping his eye. He had something in it. There was a celebration after in the open space beside the church that Mrs. Harding and half a dozen other women of the town had organized with the particular efficiency of people who have been running frontier communities for long enough to know that organization is a survival skill, with tables of food and a fiddle player and dancing as the evening came on. The kind of evening in the desert that makes you understand why people came west, the vast, warm, uncomplicated beauty of it. They danced together in the torchlight while the fiddle played and the townspeople of Carro Blanco celebrated around them, and Theresa rested her head against his chest for a moment, and he held her, and thought about the word he had been looking for when she had stepped off the stage in the July heat of last year, and he had watched her cross the main street, and felt something shift in him that he had spent the following weeks misidentifying as professional complication. The word was home. That was what she was. The specific, irreplaceable, chosen version of that. The Voss prosecution concluded that autumn, in October of 1883, when Emmett Voss entered a guilty plea to 4 counts of land fraud in exchange for a reduced sentence that would see him in the federal penitentiary in Denver for 7 years. Theresa received a formal letter from the federal marshal's office clearing her name completely. A letter she read standing at the kitchen table of the small house they had taken on the west side of Carro Blanco, and then set down very carefully on the table and stood over for a moment with her hand flat on it. Oscar came in from the back while she was standing like that and read the situation from across the room. He came and stood beside her and read the letter over her shoulder. She turned to look at him, and there were tears on her face, not dramatic ones, just the quiet tears that come when a long-held weight finally releases. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he confirmed. She put her face against his neck and he held her, and outside the window the October light was golden, and the cottonwood tree in the yard had turned completely, all gold and trembling in the slight wind, and it was one of the most peaceful moments of his life so far, which was saying something given the general trend toward improvement that his life had shown since the previous July. She had a thought that morning. Standing in the kitchen with the letter of clearance in her hand, and the October light coming through the window and Oscar's arm around her shoulders, she thought about the stage coming into Carro Blanco last July, the heat and the dust, and the particular desperate forward momentum of someone who has run out of other options. She thought about the man she had seen watching the stage with that careful, measuring stillness, and about what she had thought of him in that first moment, which was that he was a threat to be managed. She had been right and entirely wrong at the same time. Life settled into a shape after that, a good shape, the kind built from real material. Theresa's school grew. By the spring of 1884, she had 26 students and was making a case to the territorial board for a second room and an assistant teacher. Oscar continued his work as marshal with the same methodical commitment, though the work had changed in texture, had become something he carried differently now, that he carried it home to someone who understood its weight and asked the right questions, and did not require him to pretend that the imperfections of the law did not exist. They talked about everything. This had not diminished. If anything, it had deepened. The way conversations between people who are genuinely interested in each other's minds deepen over time, accumulating reference points and shared vocabulary. The specific language that develops in the space between two people who are paying real attention. In the spring of 1884, Theresa told him over breakfast that she thought she might be expecting a child, with the careful, provisional manner of someone who is trying not to fully believe something wonderful in case it turns out to be wrong. He put down his coffee cup and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and then he stood up from the table and crossed to her and put both hands on her face and kissed her forehead and her cheeks and her mouth in a sequence that was not dramatic but was very thorough. "Are you all right?" she asked, because she was a practical person who wanted specific information. "I am extremely all right," he said. The child was born in December of 1884, a boy, healthy and loud, whom they named Samuel after Theresa's father, who had believed in education and had been correct about most things. Oscar held Samuel Crawford on the evening of his birth in the lamplight of their bedroom, with an expression on his face that Theresa, watching from the bed, thought was the distilled essence of everything she had hoped for when she had stepped off a stage in a dusty town in July of a very difficult year, and somehow ended up here. The years after were full ones. Not without difficulty, because nothing in the territory was without difficulty, and life was not the kind of story that resolved all complications permanently. There were hard seasons and easy ones, years when Oscar's work brought him into proximity with danger, years when the territory's injustices were more sharply visible and more difficult to bear. There were evenings when the weight of things was heavy and conversations in the kitchen that did not resolve neatly. There was a winter when Theresa was ill for 2 months, and the town rallied around them with the instinct of a community that has learned to hold its own. And that winter was one of the times Oscar Crawford understood most completely what it meant to be afraid of losing something, the particular quality of that fear in the specific context of a person who has become your life. She recovered. She always recovered, which Oscar understood was not a guarantee, but was a feature of her particular tenacity that he was grateful for, with an ongoing depth that he tried to express directly rather than taking for granted. She had that quality of some people who meet difficulty not by becoming brittle, but by becoming more thoroughly themselves, and the woman who had crossed the main street of Carro Blanco with careful composure and desperate forward momentum had become, in the years since, someone whose composure was real, and whose momentum was purposeful, and whose laughter was one of the most frequently occurring sounds in their house. By 1887, the school had its second room and an assistant teacher, a young woman named Marion Booth, who was fresh from the normal school in Albuquerque, and who regarded Theresa with the specific admiration of someone who has found the kind of teacher they had always hoped to work for. By 1887, there was also a daughter, Eleanor, born the previous year, a dark-haired, serious-faced child who at 14 months was already regarding the world with an expression that was unmistakably her mother's, that particular focused intelligence that missed nothing. Oscar was reappointed as marshal for a third term in 1888, which was not the youngest age a man had been reappointed in the territory, but was not common either, and the appointment came with a commendation from the territorial governor that noted specifically the quality of his management of the three-county area and his contribution to several significant prosecutions, including the Voss case, which was noted with the careful legal accuracy that had redefined Oscar's role in it as a significant piece of work, rather than an irregularity. Aldrich Peel had retired by then, replaced by a man named Cortez who had a different style, but the same basic commitment to getting things right, and Cortez had reviewed the full file on the Townsend-Voss matter with the interest of someone encountering a genuinely interesting piece of case history, and had personally written to Oscar to express his appreciation for the thorough job. The censure remained in Oscar's file. He had never asked for it to be removed, and Peel's office had never offered to remove it. Oscar thought about this occasionally, and always arrived at the same conclusion, which was that the censure was an accurate record of what he had done, and what he had done had been right, and accurate records of right things done in irregular ways were not shameful. They were honest. That quality of honesty, the willingness to hold the full picture rather than the convenient one, was something he and Theresa had in common from the beginning and had deepened in both of them over the years. It had made them more complicated people in some ways. It had made them more capable ones in all the ways that mattered. In the autumn of 1889, the New Mexico Territory was in the process of the long, complicated move toward statehood that would not be completed until 1912, but the mechanisms of it were already reshaping the territory's institutions. And Carro Blanco, which had been a scrubby hope of a town when Theresa stepped off the stage in 1882, was becoming something more established. A town with proper streets and a growing commercial district, and a school that the territorial board held up as a model for frontier education. The cottonwood in their yard had grown enormous. Samuel was 5 years old and attending his mother's school with the slight awkwardness of a child, who understands that his mother is also his teacher, and is not entirely sure how to navigate this. And Alina was nearly 3 and had opinions about everything. One October morning, Theresa sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a letter from the normal school in Albuquerque, which was offering her a position on its faculty, which would have been entirely remarkable, and was in fact remarkable, an educated woman being offered a faculty position in a territorial institution in 1889. She read it twice and set it down and sat with it. Oscar came in and read her face and sat across from her. She slid the letter to him. He read it. "What do you think?" he asked. She looked at the letter on the table between them. "I think it's a great honor," she said, "and I think Carro Blanco is my home, and I think that Marion could take over the school and do it well, and I think that Albuquerque is 3 days' ride from here." She paused. "I don't know what I think." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What would you tell your students to do?" She looked at him. Then she smiled slowly, the smile that was completely hers. "I would tell them to figure out what they love most and arrange their life around it, not around what seems expected." "What do you love most?" She looked around the kitchen. Through the window she could see the cottonwood, enormous and golden in the October morning. She could hear Alina in the other room making a conversation with a rag doll. She could hear distantly the school bell from across the east side of town. "This," she said simply. "All of this. The school, the town, you and the children. This specific life in this specific place." "Then," Oscar said, "perhaps the letter should say that Theresa Townsend Crawford thanks them very much and is not able to accept, but is available to advise on curriculum matters by correspondence." She laughed. It was the full, unconstrained laugh that was still one of the best sounds he knew. "That is an extremely specific letter," she said. "I think specificity is generally useful," he said. She wrote the letter that afternoon, using Oscar's formulation with small modifications that were hers, and sent it with the next male writer, and turned back to the work of her life with the particular settled gladness of someone who has made a choice freely and knows it. The year 1889 brought one more significant thing, though it did not make itself known until the winter, when the desert nights were cold and clear, and the fire in the living room was the center of the house. Theresa told him one evening in December, with Samuel asleep down the hall and Alina barely asleep, and likely to announce her non-sleep at any moment, that she was expecting again. He reached across the table and took her hand. She was watching him with that expression, part caution and part hope, and he recognized it as the same expression she had worn when she had told him the first time, 4 years before, and the continuity of it moved him in a way that was difficult to articulate. "Good," he said. "Just good?" she asked. "Wonderful," he amended. "Entirely and completely wonderful. We might need to build on," she said practically. "I know a man who builds things," he said. The third child, born in the summer of 1890, was a boy whom they named James after Oscar's father, who had lost a ranch but had not, Oscar had finally come to believe, lost everything that mattered. James Oscar Crawford was born in June when the desert was dry and enormous and full of heat, and he announced his presence in the world with the particular urgency of someone who has a great deal to say and sees no reason to delay. Samuel, at 6, regarded his new brother with serious eyes and informed Theresa that James was very loud. Theresa agreed that James was very loud. Eleanor, at 4, was more practical about it, presenting James with a rag doll identical to her own on his second day of existence, with the air of someone providing an essential service. Oscar held James in the lamplight the evening of his birth, and felt the same thing he had felt holding Samuel, the same thing he suspected he would feel with every child they had, a love so specific and profound, and entirely without precedent in anything he had experienced before, that it still had the quality of surprise each time, the sense of something the world had been withholding for a long time and had finally given over. He looked at Theresa across the room, and she was tired and beautiful and looking at him with her own version of that expression, the one that knew exactly what he was feeling because she was feeling it too, the specific fluency of two people who have been paying close attention to each other for 8 years and understand each other in the way that matters. The years went on and were good ones. Not easy, not without loss, because the world was not a place where either of those conditions held permanently. But good in the deep way, the way that comes from having chosen correctly and lived honestly, and built something real with real material in a real place. The school grew under Theresa's continued care and Marion's capable assistance. Oscar's work continued, the territory continued its long evolution, and Carro Blanco continued to grow, adding streets and businesses and families and the particular institutional texture of a place that intends to last. One evening in the autumn of 1892, when Samuel was 8 and Eleanor was 6 and James was 2, and the house smelled like the dinner Theresa had made and the wood smoke from the living room fire, and all the accumulated particular smells of a home that has been lived in with intention, Oscar sat on the porch in the cooling evening watching the first stars come out, and Theresa came and sat beside him, handing him a cup of coffee without asking whether he wanted one, because after 10 years she knew the answer. They sat in the quiet together, with the sounds of their children inside the house behind them and the desert spread out in front of them and the stars coming on in their slow, enormous procession overhead. "Do you think about it still?" she asked, which did not require specification because after 10 years there was very little that did. He thought about what she was asking. "The warrant days," he said. "The day I arrived," she said. "What you thought then?" He was quiet for a moment, honestly examining the memory. "I thought it was going to be straightforward," he said. "I thought I was going to manage a federal matter with professional efficiency." "You thought I was a complication," she said. "No," he said, and it was true. "I thought the situation was a complication. I never thought you were." She leaned against him, her shoulder against his, and they watched the stars for a while in the good quiet between them. "What made you decide," she asked then, "to say what you said in the sheriff's office that night when Peel's man was outside? I've wondered." He considered this with the same care he gave to all the things she asked him directly. "I had been telling myself a story about you all day," he said slowly. "The federal warrant story. The story where you were a person of interest and I was an officer with an obligation, and the outcome was predetermined. And then I looked at you, standing there with your wrists rope burned and your composure entirely intact, and I thought about everything I knew about you, not the circular, the actual knowledge, and the story dissolved. It just dissolved. And what was left was the reality of you, and I could not pretend any version of letting you walk out that door in handcuffs was correct." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "That's the most complete thing you've ever said about it." "I've been working up to it," he said. She laughed quietly against his shoulder. He put his arm around her and she settled against him and they watched the stars. And inside the house, Samuel said something that made a leaner laugh, and James made his characteristic sound of determined announcement. And the fire crackled, and the desert held them in its vast and patient quiet. And this, Oscar Crawford thought, was every correct choice he had ever made, arriving at a single point in time and displaying its consequences in full. 10 years. From the July stage and the careful attention of a marshal watching a fugitive cross the main street, to this porch and this evening, and this life built in this specific place by these specific people. He thought about the sheriff's office and the rope-burned wrists and the federal marshal pacing outside, and the words that had come out of him that he had not planned. He thought about her voice when she had asked the question, "What changed?" He thought about the answer he had given, which had been everything, and which had been true but incomplete in the way that answers given in high-stakes moments are always incomplete, because the full answer is longer and requires time to unfold. The full answer was, you. The full answer was the knowledge of you, accumulated day by day across the weeks that had brought us to that impossible moment. The knowledge of your honesty and your intelligence and your courage, and the particular quality of your mind, and the way you make the world feel more real rather than less, which is the rarest thing. The full answer was that I looked at the option of letting you walk out of that door and into a process that was not going to be just, and I looked at the option of whatever it cost me to change that outcome, and the calculation was not difficult. The full answer was that some things are not complicated even when they appear to be. He felt Theresa stir slightly against his shoulder, settling more comfortably. "I love you," she said, in the same tone she would use to say something practical and true, because for her they were the same register. "I love you," he said. The stars continued their slow, enormous turning overhead. The desert was quiet. Inside the house their children were alive and full of noise and entirely themselves. The cottonwood in the yard had lost most of its leaves for the autumn, its branches dark and intricate against the darkening sky. It was 1892 in the New Mexico Territory, 10 years before statehood, in a small town on the edge of the desert that was still figuring out what it wanted to be. And in a small house on the west side of that town, two people sat on a porch in the gathering dark, and held the weight of their ordinary, extraordinary life between them with the particular care of people who know its value. Theresa Townsend Crawford turned her face up to the stars and felt the specific settled peace of someone who has found the thing she did not know she was looking for, in the place she did not know she was going, through the events she would not have chosen and was entirely glad had happened. Oscar Crawford held his wife on the porch of their home and knew, with the certainty that does not require words or proof or any justification beyond itself, the certainty that is simply permanent and complete, that this was the answer to every hard question he had ever asked himself about what any of it was for. The male rider passed on the main street below, his horse's hooves quiet in the dust, the last light fading from the western sky in long, slow, extravagant color. Somewhere across town the school bell rang once, then was still. The stars came fully out. Everything was as it should be.